Hello, this is Dr. Garrett Castleberry, Associate Professor and Program Director of Communication, Media, and Ethics at Mid-America Christian University. I'm here with a digital lecture for our COM 4413 Communication and Cultural Change group. We're looking at your weekly reading discussion questions. And as this lecture material is essentially comprised by responses to your questions, it is what we consider our asynchronous dialogue. You can hashtag that, folks. We are talking about communication and cultural change from a media studies perspective in this course. Specifically, we are examining the area of television studies. That's right, TV, the idiot box, right? The old boob tube. We're looking at it all course long, and we're analyzing it, writing about it, screening it, talking about it, everything television, and it's one of our media studies focused courses in our comm, media, and ethics majors. All right, different courses give you different access, exposure to different mediums, such is the case here. We were dressed for show in our television discussion, and I want to get to your questions. We've got some week one questions from the readings. Those readings just outside of right, my reference here. Let me get them. All right, so the books that we're checking out in the course include a dual serving of Jason Mittell, right? Man, maybe the last time we go dual method here, but Mittell's Television in American Culture, starting to feel like a new classic, right? It's getting up there in age. And then the newer Complex TV, the Poetics of Contemporary Television Programming. But that's not all. We have some questions from Marcel Danesi, Popular Culture, Introductory Perspectives, or some other areas. We'll get to those as we move along. But let's get to talking about some TV. You all have some questions. I want to get to those. Let's start off with questions from Rosalind in week one. And Rosalind writes, Mittell writes in paragraph 2 on page 7 in the introduction that the FCC cannot censor or judge content prior to its airing. My question is, do you think that there will ever be change made to this policy which will allow the FCC to censor or judge content prior to its airing? An ambitious question, Rosalind, and what I see is somewhat of an opposite unfolding. What I can sense and my understanding is content is becoming increasingly kind of progressive and less policed, and stations, media companies seem to be less discouraged or concerned about fines. All right, so you have, especially on cable channels, habitually breaking old rules that have to do with FCC regulation, some of the ethics, some of the media ethics involved, and it appears to be something. Here's the key, right? That kind of progressive movement on television actually appears to, in my observation, to be something that and I'm using these in maybe the political sense of the word, conservative groups, right? Libertarian groups and liberal groups alike applaud, because they both want restrictions. They're both groups are about lifting restrictions at its ideological core. So we're actually getting that in spades with programming, and now that so much of it is coming through in streaming networks, which all kind of operate with maybe the uncensored filter a la HBO model, that's what we're seeing. That's the movement we're seeing. So the FCC has less power than ever, and I can't imagine the circumstances in which they're getting that power back. Mittell also writes on page 7 in the introduction, quote, airwaves are a public resource used by private industries to serve the public interest, end quote. My question is, do you agree or disagree that in most instances, private industries are serving their own interests rather than the interests of the public? it's just agree or disagree, I agree. I agree. They are private companies are out for private sort of resources, right? The public interest is not always. If it got in the way of them making money, maybe they would become interested. But that's about it. That's where the buck stops. Mattel writes in chapter 5 on page 195 in the last paragraph that, quote, editing is a highly unnatural way of viewing the world, end quote. My question is, do you agree or disagree that editing, there we go again, can be intentionally misleading, deceptive to most viewers, and therefore dangerous in some instances? That could be a slippery slope, right? This sort of that the deception of editing naturally leads to dangerous situations. I mean, it naturally leads to us to view television as narrative. It naturally leads us to supplant narrative and entertainment for real life experience. So, but this idea of editing and the power of editing reminds me of a theory we've encountered before in our curriculum, framing theory, right? Kind of looking at framework. And if you think about, what am I trying to say here? Even the example of documentaries, right? And how documentaries, they frame something, they frame an argument for us. They even, let's use a TV documentary example. All of these true crime docudramas, they take evidence, just like, let's say a law enforcement agent, and they siphon through it, and they have to determine, just like maybe a law enforcement official determines what happened or who did what, right? They're piecing together history. That editors do the same thing. They have lots of footage. They have lots of content. They have a template, usually, a blueprint, the script, and they're trying to map that out accordingly. Okay, let me jump pages here and hop over to a few questions from Kimberly. All right, welcome aboard. Kimberly's commenting on the Twilight Zone episode 22 from season 1. The monsters are due on Maple Street, a classic. All right, one reason it's written about in an excerpt we checked out from Ethan Thompson and Jason Mattel's How to Watch TV anthology. By the way, I've seen recently this anthology has just entered its 2nd edition. And so congratulations to all of those authors. The invitation must have gotten lost in the mail to contribute to How to Watch TV. Who knows more about watching television than old Dr. G? Come on now. All right. So on with Kimberly's commentary. Question 1, this episode is so good. His writing was amazing and the subject matter relevant still today. Doesn't this episode seem a little ahead of its time? Was it controversial when it first aired? All right, Monsters Are Due on Maple Street wasn't alive when it aired. Doesn't mean I can't comment on it, though. Yes, in some ways, it's ahead of its time, but we can actually think about it in terms of, this is a literary function, right? This allegorical storytelling has always been a powerful tool, okay? And the consistency of the Twilight Zone, I think that consistency, that idea of quality television was ahead of its time. TV was very experimental for decades, and in some ways kind of still is, but it's definitely, I mean, it is when it's innovative, but it was innovative of its time, and a lot of that can kind of carry over to today. But let's look at the second question that ties in. There weren't any fancy special effects with the Twilight Zone, or all of its blood and gore, or all of the blood and gore that we see today on programming. Yet we got to the point and the same feeling with the shooting. When did it become acceptable to show all that they show on television today? So I think we're referring to that the sort of the extremes that a lot of shows do go to today. And there's been a kind of erosion to the way content is policed, a lot more risks taken, and then over time those risks kind of become the new norm, the new standard, and so on. And so that's what we can understand as being progressive. And that's interesting, that ties into questions we were just fielding from Rosalind with relation to FCC regulation and how they used to have a lot of control and they used to swing that power around and really keep a tight lid on things. And a program or a TV producer or a network could get in quote unquote hot water with the general public if that happened. And then the advertisers would respond, meaning they would lose advertising in those sacred commercial breaks. Well, okay, let's tie commercial advertising to the streaming era, the digital era. People don't want to see commercials anymore, so they're willing to pay more for the content. And in addition, they want increasingly kind of uncensored or the full artist's take of that content, right? And so you've got this a la carte business model occurring, and the advertisers no longer have as heavy of pressure upon the producers. Makes sense? But it in terms of when it's become acceptable, that sort of thing, it was a slow crawl over time, right? This is a historical thing. This is why studying the history of a medium like television gives us a lot of insight. We can see these markers taking place over time, where program shifts occur, where audience voices kind of increase in certain ways, or where just methods of production enhance over time. But I think about, technological advances, and I think that's the significant markers, right? You have the advent of satellite dishes, satellite TV, the pay-per-view is born, and cable, right? Cable coming about in the late 70s, essentially 1980s. And then we've got all these boundary pushing series that come as a result, many of them in the 90s. There are the things on the paid channels, something like Oz or The Sopranos on HBO, but you have network broadcast programming like, I don't know, Miami Vice was kind of doing a lot of different things in the 80s. And then you had a show like NYPD Blue being a little bit more mature in prime time in the 90s. And then, police procedural, that's a classic genre of storytelling. And even shows that are seemingly kind of conservative, like a CSI, they still kind of, they sneak some interesting things in there in a kind of under the radar fashion. And I think that's been something CBS has been successful with over the last quarter century. In response to Derek Compere's Twilight Zone landmark television essay, Kimberly comments on page 300, how did Rod Sterling make the switch from what was popular, live comedy variety shows, to the Twilight Zone? And this is a nice segue from the most recent comments, because variety shows were one of these earliest genre forms on TV. TV had to find its own footing, just like we've seen the internet and some of these types of channels searching for identity in the 21st century. Was it acceptable initially? I assume talking about the Twilight Zone, or did it take a while for viewers to embrace? And I could have looked this up, and I guess should have, technically speaking, but it needed to have a certain level of immediate success, or in those days, a show would last a full season most likely, but if the ratings weren't stellar, it would be canceled after a year. And this is a show that did last a healthy span, 4 or 5 solid seasons, and they were making way more episodes then than some of the shows we're accustomed to now. So, yes. Additional question, did it work because it took viewers out of their comfort zone? And I would return to this idea of allegory, right? And allegory works because it often gives us an escapist template, but on the surface, right? The storytelling surface is escapist in nature, but it deeply resonates with us, with the themes that are kind of bubbling beneath, that are very contemporary, that we can identify with. All right. So that'll conclude a first set of questions here from a couple of you all, and we'll be right back with next segment. We'll dive into some more Q&A.